What does respect mean to you? Is it the way someone looks you in the eye, the tone of their voice, or simply being treated as though you belong? Now imagine sitting in first class, a seat you paid for, a status you earned, and still being told, without words but through actions, that you are invisible. That was the reality Naomi Sinclair, a black CEO at the height of her career, faced when she was denied the very meal she had reserved while others around her dined without question. In that moment, she stood at a crossroads. Should she stay quiet, swallow the insult, and move on as so many are forced to do, or should she take a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who has ever been told subtly or directly that they didn't belong? Put yourself in her seat. What would you have done? This is not a story about food. It is about dignity, power, and the courage to confront injustice in one of the most unexpected places, the sky. If you believe every story like this deserves to be heard, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin. The glass walls of JFK's Terminal 4 shimmered under the late afternoon sun, casting long golden beams across polished floors. Business travelers wheeled sleek carry-ons behind them, families corralled restless children, and a soft murmur of multiple languages filled the air. At Gate 27, however, there was a subtle shift in energy. People noticed her. Naomi Sinclair. At 42, Naomi was more than a CEO. She was a presence, the kind of woman who walked into a room and changed its rhythm without saying a word. Tall, with sharp yet graceful features, her skin glowed with the warmth of deep mahogany. Her hair, a crown of soft curls tied neatly at the nape, carried both elegance and defiance. She didn't need designer logos to announce her worth, but today, her fitted charcoal blazer and crisp ivory blouse spoke of quiet power. Naomi was the founder and chief executive of Aurelia Dynamics, a New York-based powerhouse in artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. Under her leadership, Aurelia had built systems now relied on by major banks, defense contractors, and even parts of the U.S. government. But Naomi wasn't flying to Zurich for just another business deal. This was about expansion into Europe, a billion-dollar partnership that would place Aurelia among the world's leading technology firms. And yet, even with all that accomplishment, she felt the same weight she always carried when walking into luxury spaces, the questioning eyes. As she handed her passport to the gate agent, Naomi caught the faintest pause. The woman behind the counter, polite smile glued on, scanned the document, her eyes darting between Naomi's face and the platinum first-class boarding pass in her hand. The smile flickered just slightly before returning. "Welcome aboard. Ms. Sinclair, first-class boarding now." Naomi offered a soft nod. "Thank you." She had learned long ago not to linger on these micro moments. Too many could crush your spirit. But that didn't mean she didn't notice them. She noticed everything. Walking down the jet bridge, she let her fingertips brush against the cool metal railing, steadying herself. Not her body, her mind. She knew the long hours ahead would require patience. Her seat, 1A, awaited her. Always 1A. She booked it whenever possible, not for vanity but for symbolism. The very front. The spot where no one could pretend she didn't belong. Inside the cabin, the air was perfumed with a subtle blend of leather and citrus. First class gleamed in shades of beige and gold, with wide leather seats that promised comfort and service, designed to make one forget they were thousands of feet in the air. Naomi stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the carpet. The lead flight attendant, Melissa Grant, greeted her with a rehearsed smile. "Welcome aboard, ma'am." There was a pause, just a second too long, before Melissa turned her attention to the white businessman behind Naomi, a man in his 50s carrying nothing but a slim briefcase. "Good evening, Mr. Wallace. Always a pleasure to see you again." Melissa's voice grew warmer, her smile broader. She leaned slightly forward as she gestured toward his seat. Naomi said nothing. She placed her carry-on in the overhead bin herself, lowering it with the same composure she used when signing contracts worth millions. She had long grown used to such selective warmth, given generously to some, sparingly to others. Sliding into seat 1A, Naomi exhaled. The leather was soft, the legroom endless, the small glass of sparkling water already waiting on her tray table. She reached for her tablet, swiping through final notes on the Zurich contract. Numbers filled the screen, but her mind drifted. She remembered her mother's words, spoken decades ago when Naomi was a child growing up in Atlanta. "They may try to shrink you, baby, with looks, with silence, with little cuts they hope you won't notice. But remember, only you decide your size." Those words had carried Naomi through Ivy League classrooms where she was the only black woman, through boardrooms where men interrupted her mid-sentence, through media interviews where reporters insisted on framing her success as lucky. And now, here she was again, stepping into another world of polished privilege, silently reminding herself that her presence wasn't a favor, it was earned. As passengers settled in around her, she observed the cabin. Two white men in tailored suits joked loudly about hedge funds. A woman in pearls adjusted her Chanel scarf, glancing at Naomi with fleeting curiosity before returning to her champagne flute. Naomi sipped her water slowly. To the casual observer, she looked calm, focused, but inside, she carried a familiar blend of vigilance and fatigue. She had promised herself she would enjoy this flight, read, maybe sleep, land refreshed. But deep down, she knew better. Something always happened. The intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Luminaire Flight 829 to Zurich. We are honored to have you with us this evening." The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling preparation for takeoff. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment, whispering to herself, almost like a mantra, "You belong here. You've always belonged here." Little did she know, this journey would not only test that belief but shake an entire industry. For now, though, the engines roared to life, the plane began to taxi, and Naomi Sinclair sat in seat 1A front row, first class, exactly where she was meant to be. The plane lifted smoothly into the night sky, Manhattan's glittering skyline shrinking into a patchwork of light below, inside the cocoon of first class. Conversations grew softer. A few passengers already reclining their seats, sipping wine as though this cabin existed in another world, far removed from the hum of the crowded economy section behind the curtain. Naomi adjusted the seat belt across her lap and let her head rest briefly against the window. The city she had built her life in shimmered far beneath her, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself the luxury of stillness. Seat 1A was more than just leather and legroom. It was symbolic. It was hers. Every time she booked it, she reminded herself of all the rungs she had climbed to claim it. Her fingers hovered over her tablet before she set it aside. Instead, she reached into her carry-on and pulled out a worn leather journal. It wasn't for business. Naomi had been writing in it since she was 12, capturing moments, recording promises to herself. Tonight, she flipped to a blank page, the faint lines waiting for words. She wrote only one sentence. Remember why you're here. Her mind drifted to the deal awaiting her in Zurich. Aurelia Dynamics had been negotiating with Helvetia SecureTech, a Swiss conglomerate, for nearly a year. The partnership would expand Aurelia's reach into Europe, cementing Naomi as the first black woman to lead a multinational AI company at that scale. But for Naomi, it wasn't just about business. It was about rewriting what power looked like in spaces where people like her had long been excluded. She smiled faintly, recalling a conversation with her father. Thomas, years ago, he had been a mechanic his whole life, hands rough and stained, yet his wisdom was sharp. One night, after Naomi had won her first major contract, he told her, "Baby girl, you're not just walking through doors for yourself. You're building new ones for those who'll come after you." That memory warmed her chest now as she watched the attendants begin their service. Melissa Grant moved briskly down the aisle, her posture straight, smile fixed. Naomi studied her, not out of suspicion but habit. In Naomi's world, awareness was survival. She noticed how Melissa's voice lifted when she addressed the man in 1C, calling him Mr. Wallace with cheerful familiarity. When she passed Naomi, the tone cooled, polite but distant, the smile mechanical. Naomi adjusted her blazer and glanced at the seat number plaque beside her. 1A gleamed softly under the cabin lights. She had chosen it deliberately. In every flight she could, Naomi claimed 1A, a reminder to herself that her place was never accidental. Each time she settled into this seat, she reaffirmed what her mother Angela had taught her, that belonging wasn't given. It was claimed. Still, Naomi felt the old tension coil in her chest. No matter how high she climbed, there was always the question, spoken or unspoken, of whether she deserved to be there. She carried that weight quietly, rarely showing it, but in moments like this, surrounded by tailored suits and pearls, the silent tug of invisibility pressed against her ribs. She unfolded the in-flight menu placed neatly on her tray. For tonight, she had pre-ordered a meal days in advance, roasted sea bass with truffle risotto, paired with a glass of California Cabernet Sauvignon. She had chosen it carefully, not because she needed luxury, but because it was her ritual. Every deal, every milestone trip, she reminded herself of her right to enjoy the same privileges as anyone else. She leaned back and closed her eyes, letting the faint hum of the engines wash over her. In her mind, she traced the arc of her life, the girl who used to walk miles to the library in Atlanta, the teenager who coded her first program on a second-hand computer, the young woman who faced rejection letters that spoke of lack of fit. Each memory rose and fell like the engine's drone, steady, inevitable, pushing her forward. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as dinner service approached. Naomi opened her eyes again, watching as Melissa rolled the cart down the aisle. Platters clinked, glasses sparkled, laughter floated from 1C and 1D. Naomi noticed how Melissa bent slightly closer to Mr. Wallace as she poured his wine, her voice warm, conversational. When Melissa reached Naomi's seat, there was no warmth, only the stiff, professional tone of obligation. Naomi held her gaze for a moment, her expression neutral. She had learned to master silence, to use it as a mirror. People often revealed themselves when faced with quiet. "Ms. Sinclair, I'll return with your meal shortly," Melissa said, barely glancing at the order slip in her hand. Naomi nodded once, her face composed. Inside, she repeated her father's words, "You're building new doors." The cart rattled away, leaving behind the faint scent of butter and garlic. Naomi looked out the window again. Below, the Atlantic stretched endless and dark, dotted with tiny pinpricks of light from scattered ships. The night sky above was vast, infinite. Somewhere in that vastness, she reminded herself, her presence was a signal to others that space could be made. A sudden vibration on her smartwatch drew her attention. A secure message from Elijah Carter, her trusted executive assistant, glowed on the screen. "Contracts ready for Zurich. Board is aligned. You just need to sign." Naomi tapped a quick response. "Thank you, Elijah. Stay on standby. I'll update you after landing." She smiled faintly. Elijah was more than an assistant. He was her anchor. Someone who understood the storm she navigated daily, who never questioned her place. Their professional bond had been forged in fire through late nights, failed bids, and relentless scrutiny. His presence in her corner reminded her she was never truly alone. Naomi placed the watch back against her wrist and exhaled. Seat 1A enveloped her, the hum of the engines steadying her heartbeat. She didn't know what awaited her in Zurich beyond contracts and cameras, but she did know this every flight carried with it a test, sometimes subtle, sometimes harsh. Tonight, she braced herself without even realizing it, because she had learned across decades of living in her skin, in her place, in her fight, that discrimination rarely announced itself loudly. It whispered, it smirked, it served champagne to one passenger and silence to another, and if you weren't paying attention, you might convince yourself it was nothing. But Naomi Sinclair paid attention. Always. She closed her journal and tucked it back into her bag, sliding the zipper shut with a soft, deliberate motion. She leaned into the seat, eyes focused on the aisle, as Melissa approached again. This time, the tray in her hands would tell a story far larger than a meal, and though Naomi couldn't yet see the storm forming, she could feel the air tightening, like the sky before lightning. For now, she sat quietly in seat 1A, reminding herself she belonged. She had always belonged. The clink of silverware filled the cabin, mingling with low conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. Naomi shifted slightly in her seat, her gaze drifting from the window to the aisle. Dinner service had begun, and she watched as the rituals of luxury unfolded, glasses refilled, plates carried with practiced elegance, smiles shared like currency. She had told herself not to notice, to focus on Zurich, on contracts, on her steady path forward. But her mind had always been trained to observe. It was how she had built Aurelia Dynamics, by paying attention to the details others missed. And now, those details surrounded her. Melissa Grant was precise, but her precision was selective. Naomi noticed how Melissa bent lower when she spoke to the woman in pearls, her tone warm, her laugh genuine. She saw how Melissa lingered at Mr. Wallace's seat, asking if he preferred still or sparkling water, if his steak should be medium or medium rare. But when Melissa reached Naomi, her words were stripped to the basics. No warmth, no familiarity, just function. Naomi didn't react. She never did at first. She had been here before, in boardrooms, restaurants, hotels. She knew the look that said, "You're not who we expected here." She knew the tone that carried respect for the seat, but not for the person in it. Melissa returned with a tray, setting it down gently on Naomi's table. a small salad, its leaves pale under the dim light. No introduction of the dish, no mention of the wine pairing. Just a plate placed and a smile so quick it barely brushed her lips. Naomi lifted her fork slowly, tasting the greens. She chewed with deliberate calm, though a familiar ache formed in her chest. It wasn't the food. It never was. It was the reminder that no matter how far she had come, some would still insist on seeing her as less. Her thoughts drifted back to her early years at Aurelia. She remembered walking into a venture capital meeting, pitching her first major product. The men around the table had listened, nodding politely, before turning to her male co-founder, asking him the questions as if Naomi were invisible. She had sat there, pulse racing, biting back the urge to demand recognition. Later, when the deal closed in her favor, one of those same men had told her she was lucky to have such good support. Naomi swallowed the last bite of salad and sipped her water. Her hands rested on her lap, steady, but her mind was alive with memory. She wondered how many others on this flight carried stories like hers, silences that weighed heavier than words. The cart rattled down the aisle again, laden with entrees. The aroma of seared beef and butter drifted toward her. Naomi leaned back, waiting for her sea base and risotto, the meal she had chosen with care. When Melissa stopped at her seat, however, her tone was clipped. "I'm afraid your pre-ordered entree is unavailable tonight. Ms. Sinclair, we only have turkey sandwiches left." Naomi blinked once, her face unreadable. "Unavailable," she repeated softly. Melissa nodded, already turning the cart toward the next passenger. "Yes, ma'am, that's all we have." Naomi's eyes followed the tray Melissa carried to 1C, where Mr. Wallace received his filet mignon, steam rising from the plate. He smiled as Melissa poured his wine, the glass tilted with graceful care. Naomi's gaze returned to her own table, where a plastic-wrapped sandwich now sat. Turkey, lettuce, a smear of mayonnaise pressed against dry bread. She placed her hands on either side of it, steadying herself. The ache in her chest deepened, pressing against her ribs. It was never about the food. It was about the message, about being reminded, again and again, that her presence could be tolerated but never honored. She thought of her mother Angela, who had worked double shifts at the hospital, who had come home exhausted but still cooked dinner, still asked Naomi about her day. Angela had once told her, "Respect isn't something you beg for. It's something they reveal about themselves." Naomi inhaled slowly, letting the words settle. She picked up the sandwich, peeling away the wrapper with deliberate care. She took a small bite, chewing slowly, her expression calm. Inside, though, the storm gathered. As she ate, her thoughts tangled with memories. The time she had been asked if she was the assistant at her own product launch. The moment a journalist had insisted her success was a token gesture of diversity. The countless dinners where servers had brought the check to her male colleague, assuming he was the decision-maker. Her jaw tightened. She swallowed hard. Naomi rested the sandwich back on the tray and reached for her journal. She opened to the page she had left blank earlier and wrote another line beneath her first note. "Don't let them decide your worth." Melissa passed by again, checking on other passengers. Naomi caught fragments of her voice, light and conversational. "Would you like another glass? Mr. Wallace is the temperature to your liking. Mrs." Collins, each word floated through the cabin like silk. None of that softness had been offered to Naomi. She closed the journal slowly and set it aside, Her smartwatch buzzed once, a reminder from Elijah to rest, to conserve energy for Zurich. Naomi glanced at the screen but didn't respond. She sat still, breathing in, breathing out, watching as the plates of lobster and steak passed her by. Inside, her thoughts churned. She wasn't angry in the way people imagined anger, loud, sharp, explosive. No, her anger was quiet, deliberate. It was the kind that burned slow, like coals, waiting for the right moment to ignite. She thought again of her father's voice. Some storms, you don't fight. Some storms, you become... Naomi took another bite of the sandwich, slow and measured. The bread was dry, the turkey bland, but each chew was a decision. She would not react here, in this aisle, under Melissa's gaze. She would act where it mattered, where silence could no longer be mistaken for surrender. The hum of the engines deepened as the plane soared higher, the Atlantic stretching endless below. Naomi leaned back into her seat, eyes closed for a brief moment, letting the storm within her settle into resolve. The slights had always been small, but tonight they would no longer remain small. Tonight they would carry consequences. The cabin glowed with the soft amber of overhead lights. Shadows curling across the aisle as trays clinked and glasses chimed. Naomi sat still in Sot 1A, the sandwich untouched now, its wrapper folded neatly as if she were preserving evidence. The scent of roasted beef and garlic butter lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. Each breath carried the reminder that her choice, her reservation, her dignity had been dismissed. Melissa returned once more, her steps quick, her eyes avoiding direct contact. She moved with ease between the other passengers, her voice laced with warmth that seemed to melt into every corner but Naomi's. When she passed Naomi's seat, she offered a brief nod, professional but cold. It was the same kind of politeness Naomi had felt 1,000 times before, the kind that carried no humanity, only procedure. Naomi lifted her gaze and studied the tray in front of her again. She thought of the email confirmation she had received 3 days ago. The menu she had selected was clear roasted sea bass with truffle risotto, a dish chosen as carefully as one chooses words for a contract. It was a ritual, a quiet celebration of belonging. Now, replaced by the cheapest option on board, it mocked that belonging. She closed her eyes, but instead of peace, a memory rose. Years ago, in her late 20s, she'd flown to San Francisco to meet a venture capitalist. She had checked into a hotel where the concierge looked her over, then directed her to a side entrance, assuming she was staff. She had walked through that door, her heels clicking against the concrete floor of a service hallway, her chest tight with fury. That night, she had sworn never again to let someone's misjudgment dictate her path. Yet here she was, decades later, with the same sting pressed against her ribs. Naomi inhaled slowly, releasing the breath with precision. She adjusted her posture, shoulders square, chin lifted, as though she were back in a boardroom facing skeptical investors. To anyone watching, she looked composed, even serene. Inside, though, the weight of accumulated slights pressed heavier than the airplane cabin at 30,000 feet. Melissa leaned into 1C, pouring wine for Mr. Wallace. His laugh, hearty and self-assured, filled the air. Naomi heard his words float toward her. Service is always perfect on this airline. They know how to treat their loyal customers. His statement cut sharper than Melissa's silence. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She had learned the art of restraint young. Restraint had given her the patience to build Aurelia dynamics from nothing. Restraint had allowed her to listen when others underestimated her, to absorb their doubt and transform it into resolve. Tonight, restraint whispered to her again. Don't act now. Act when it counts. She glanced at her smartwatch. A quiet vibration pulsed against her wrist. Elijah had sent another message, reminder, get some rest if you can. Big day tomorrow. She typed a reply quickly, her fingers steady, not tired, observing. Then she closed the screen, her reflection faint against the glass surface, her eyes dark pools of thought. The sandwich sat between them still, and Naomi touched its edge lightly with her fingertip. She considered the symbolism of it cheap, ordinary, careless, a reminder of how dignity could be stripped in small gestures, as simple as replacing a promised meal with leftovers. The image of it seared into her mind, a metaphor she knew would stay long after the flight ended. Her mother's voice drifted back again. Angela Sinclair, soft but unyielding, had once told her, "It's never just about what they take away. Naomi, it's about what they're telling you doesn't belong to you." Naomi felt that truth now, lodged beneath her ribs. This wasn't about fish or risotto. It was about the silent message that her place in Siat 1A was conditional, subject to someone else's judgment. She straightened the sandwich wrapper until it was perfectly flat, then set it aside. Her movements were calm, deliberate, as though she were cataloging evidence at a crime scene. Each action served to ground her, to remind herself she wasn't imagining what had just occurred. Outside the window, the Atlantic stretched black and endless. Naomi traced the horizon line with her eyes, the faint glow of stars above the ocean. Somewhere out there was Zurich, where contracts awaited, where her company's future lay. She had boarded this flight believing her greatest challenge would be negotiating billions in agreements. Yet here, at 30,000 feet, she faced another kind of negotiation, the eternal battle for recognition. For respect, a thought flickered in her mind. How many others have sat in this very seat, handed something lesser, told in silence they didn't belong, that thought burned hotter than the humiliation itself. The idea that countless unnamed faces had endured this pattern, had swallowed it quietly, made her chest ache with a heavy empathy. Naomi placed her hands in her lap, her fingers interlaced. She whispered inwardly, "What do you do, Naomi? Do you let it slide? Again? Or do you answer?" She remembered her father, Thomas, his hands blackened with oil from years in the garage. He had once said, "People will hand you scraps and expect you to say thank you. Don't. Build your own table. And when you do, don't ever let them serve scraps there." The hum of the engines filled the silence that followed, a low vibration that seemed to echo her father's words. Naomi opened her journal again, pen poised above the paper. She wrote, "Even at 30,000 feet, the ground still shifts beneath us, but I will steady it." She closed the journal and set it aside once more. Then she leaned back, her gaze fixed forward. The curtain between first class and economy swayed gently with the motion of the plane, a thin divider that meant more than fabric. She thought of all the invisible curtains drawn around her in life, and the quiet resolve hardened. She took another slow breath. The decision was made, though she had not spoken it aloud. She would not let this pass, not for herself alone, but for every voice silenced by a sandwich, by a look, by a tone. The storm inside her no longer asked if she should respond. It asked only when. As the cabin settled into the rhythm of dinner, Naomi remained still. She was the picture of composure, yet her mind was already aligning the pieces. She didn't yet know how the night would unfold, only that she would not leave Zurich with the same silence she had boarded with. The sandwich sat untouched, and Naomi let it. It was no longer food. It was a reminder, a symbol. And, soon, it would become the evidence that sparked something larger than the cabin could contain. The clatter of plates faded as dessert service began. A faint sweetness of chocolate mousse floated through the cabin, mixing with the sharper tang of coffee. Naomi sat unmoving, her sandwich still on the tray table, like a relic of a choice someone else had made for her. The other passengers savored their multi-course meals while attendants floated by, attentive, graceful, never once stumbling in their choreography. Yet, to Naomi, the air felt heavier with each passing minute. She leaned back against the headrest, her eyes closed. From the outside, she looked composed, perhaps even relaxed. Inside, however, a storm pressed against her ribs. It wasn't new. This quiet anger had lived with her for decades, not the kind that screamed, but the kind that simmered, patient, calculating. She had learned long ago that open rage made her a caricature in others' eyes. Anger from someone like her was never read as righteous. It was branded threatening. She whispered inwardly, almost like a prayer, "Stay still. Don't give them what they expect." But her mind would not still. Images flooded her the first time she'd walked into Aurelia's early office, a rented space above a laundromat. She remembered the excitement, the hope, and the quiet fear that none of it would matter, that she would pour her soul into something only to be dismissed again. She remembered her first big client meeting, where a board member had leaned across the table and said, "Are you sure you can handle this kind of responsibility?" His tone had been sweet, his words bitter. Naomi's eyes opened slowly. The overhead lights caught the faint sheen of determination across her face. She thought of Angela, her mother, who had always carried herself with grace despite exhaustion. Angela had endured whispered comments in hospital hallways, endured being mistaken for custodial staff even while wearing her nurse's uniform. Yet she had returned home each night, cooked dinner, asked Naomi about her homework, kissed her forehead as if the world outside could not touch the home they built inside. Naomi straightened in her seat, her breath steady. She could almost hear Angela now. "Don't let them take your peace, baby, but don't ever let them think your silence is consent." Her hand drifted to the journal again, but this time she didn't write. Instead, she traced the edge of the leather cover, thinking. She asked herself the question that had lingered in every stage of her life. Do you fight, or do you let it pass? She closed her eyes and saw another memory, a luxury hotel lobby years ago, during a conference in Paris. She had approached the front desk with her reservation, only to be told curtly that check-in was for guests only. The man behind her, white, dressed casually, had been welcomed with champagne and smiles. Naomi had stood there, heart pounding, before demanding to see a manager. The apology came quickly, but the sting remained longer than the stay itself. Her lips tightened. She had let so many moments pass because she couldn't fight them all. But tonight felt different. Tonight, it wasn't just another slight. Tonight, it was the culmination of 1,000 cuts, and cuts, left unaddressed, became scars. Naomi opened her eyes again, the cabin lights reflecting in her steady gaze. She considered confronting Melissa directly, imagined herself pressing the issue right here, demanding answers in front of everyone. But another part of her whispered against it. She knew how that story would end, not with truth, but with accusations of overreacting, with eyes turning toward her as though she were the disruption. Her smartwatch pulsed once more. A new message from Elijah appeared. Everything aligned for Zurich. Trust yourself. You've got this. She tapped the screen but didn't respond. Instead, she whispered softly to herself, "Do I eat the sandwich? Or do I make sure this never happens again?" The words hung in the air, unheard by anyone else. They were less a question than a vow. The engines hummed a steady rhythm beneath her feet, a reminder of the thousands of miles left before Zurich. She had hours to think, hours to decide how to carry the storm that now churned inside her. But even as she debated, part of her knew the choice had already been made. She thought of Thomas, her father, his rough hands guiding hers when she was a child, learning to fix a broken radio. He had said, "When something doesn't work, you don't just accept it's broken, you find the fault and you fix it. Otherwise, you'll be listening to silence forever." Naomi smiled faintly at the memory. He hadn't just been talking about radios. She looked down at the sandwich one last time, then pushed the tray table back. The motion final. She would not accept silence forever. Her mind shifted into the familiar cadence of strategy. She thought of the systems Aurelia had built, the safeguards and protocols she had insisted on embedding into every partnership contract. She remembered drafting clauses with her legal team, insisting that dignity was not optional but integral to any alliance. She had known there would come a time when those clauses would matter more than signatures and money. Naomi exhaled deeply, letting her hands rest against the armrests. Her anger settled into something sharper, more precise. It was no longer a storm pressing against her ribs. It was a current running beneath her skin, powerful and directed. She whispered once more, only for herself, "Not tonight. Not again." The cabin carried on around her, laughter and chatter filling the air. Melissa's voice floated back from a few rows behind, light and sweet as she offered dessert. Naomi closed her eyes, not to sleep but to focus. The anger inside her was no longer quiet, but it was controlled. It was waiting, ready to be released, not in an outburst, but in a strike measured and undeniable. Her choice was made. She would act, not now, not here, but in a way that would leave no room for dismissal, no space for denial. She leaned her head back against the seat, breathing evenly, her face serene once more. To anyone watching, Naomi Sinclair looked like a woman simply preparing for sleep before a long day ahead. But inside, the decision pulsed like a second heartbeat. The slights of this night would not remain slights. They would become evidence, and that evidence would demand accountability. For the first time since boarding, Naomi allowed herself a small smile, faint but certain. Quiet anger had been her companion for years. Tonight, it would become her weapon. The cabin had grown quieter. Most of the passengers had reclined their seats, settling under soft blankets, their glasses of wine half finished on the armrests. The overhead lights dimmed to a muted glow, leaving the cabin caught between wakefulness and sleep. Naomi, however, felt anything but drowsy. Her mind was alive, sparking with memories, questions, and the weight of everything that meal represented. She adjusted her seat upright and pulled her leather journal closer. This time, not to write, but to turn through its pages. Each line of handwriting carried years of her thoughts, boardroom reflections, sketches of tech ideas, notes from conversations with her parents. She landed on a page she had written 5 years earlier, after Aurelia Dynamics had secured its first government contract. The ink had faded slightly, but the words still stung. They shook my hand, but they didn't look in my eyes. They see the deal, not the woman who made it. Her hand lingered on the words, and for a moment she felt the sting of that day as if it had been yesterday. She remembered walking out of that boardroom into the cold rain, her tailored suit damp, her head held high but her heart heavy. That boardroom had reminded her of her father's words about fixing radios the sound wouldn't return until someone acknowledged what was broken. Naomi let her eyes drift to the window. The ocean stretched endlessly below, an expanse of black dotted with faint streaks of moonlight. Flying thousands of feet above the Atlantic, she felt both untouchably high and strangely exposed. The silence reminded her of another flight long ago, her very first in business class when Aurelia was just beginning to find its footing. She had been so excited, so proud, until an attendant had asked if she was sure she belonged up front. She had laughed it off, pretending not to care, but later that night, in the quiet of her hotel room, she had cried into her pillow. She was older now, harder, sharper, but not immune. No matter how many deals she closed, how many headlines her company made, moments like this one gnawed at her. They reminded her that the world still measured her presence as an exception, not the norm. A whisper of fabric caught her attention. Melissa walked past again, her perfume lingering briefly in the air. Naomi didn't look up, but she felt it the deliberate way Melissa's gaze slid past her, the studied avoidance that said, "I don't see you, and I don't have to." It was the same move Naomi had faced countless times, in classrooms, in elevators, in the hushed conversations of conferences. That glance, that dismissal, was almost worse than open insult. Her mind returned suddenly to her mother, Angela. One night when Naomi had been 12, she had overheard Angela crying quietly in the kitchen after a long shift. Naomi had tiptoed in, scared, asking if something was wrong. Angela had pulled her close and whispered, "Nothing's wrong with me, baby. It's the world that's a little broken, but don't you ever let it break you." Naomi's throat tightened. She rubbed her temple gently, trying to steady herself. That memory had carried her through every rejection, every sideways glance, every patronizing remark disguised as politeness. Tonight, it carried her again. She tapped her smartwatch, pulling up the secure dashboard of Sentinel Nexus. A quiet hum of data flickered across the small screen timestamps of crew movements, audio snippets flagged by the system, service logs pulled in real time. Sentinel Nexus was built not just as a security measure, but as a mirror, to show the truth systems often tried to hide. Naomi watched the data quietly, the anger in her chest cooling into a deliberate focus. One flagged snippet caught her attention, Melissa's voice, recorded when she had spoken to another attendant just minutes earlier. "She'll manage. Give the good plates to the ones who matter." Naomi's jaw clenched. It wasn't loud, it wasn't cruel in tone, but it was enough. Subtle, precise, cutting, exactly the kind of discrimination that lived in shadows, hard to prove but impossible to ignore. She saved the clip, encrypting it instantly. Every piece mattered, every shrug, every dismissive word would add weight to the evidence. Naomi knew she couldn't confront Melissa directly yet. She would wait, let the system reveal itself through its own cracks. Her mind drifted again, but this time it wasn't to pain, it was to strength. She remembered the night Aurelia Dynamics had landed its biggest investor. She had walked into a skyscraper lobby with only 2 employees at her side, facing a boardroom full of skeptics. She had pitched for 2 hours, defending every line of code, every projection, every risk. At the end, one of the men had leaned back, smirking, and asked, "And what happens if you fail?" Naomi had looked at him squarely and replied, "Then I will fail more gracefully than you ever succeeded." The silence in that room had been her first victory. That same resolve filled her now. She wouldn't let Melissa's smirk, or that sandwich, or the silence of the other passengers define her place in this cabin. Seat 2A was hers, earned through sweat and brilliance, not handed by luck. She was tired of proving she belonged, but she wasn't tired of fighting for dignity. A sudden turbulence jolted the cabin slightly. Glasses clinked, and a few passengers stirred. Naomi steadied her tray table with one hand, unfazed. The shake reminded her of the world itself, always unstable, always threatening to throw her off balance. Yet she remained grounded, centered. As the cabin settled again, she noticed Jonathan Reeves's name appear on her encrypted contact list. She hovered her finger over it, considering Jonathan, the CEO of Luminaire, had partnered with Aurelia before. He respected her, at least professionally, but respect wasn't always enough. Should she escalate now, mid-flight, or wait until she had everything lined up? Naomi pulled her hand back. Not yet. Timing mattered. Her father had always said that fixing things required patience, strike too soon, and you only bend the wires further out of place. She would wait until the plane touched down, until she could leverage not just anger, but evidence, structure, truth. She leaned back again, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Around her, the cabin returned to its hushed rhythm. A passenger, 2 rows back, chuckled at a joke. Another sighed contentedly under their blanket. Naomi sat silent, her gaze fixed forward. The storm within her was no longer uncontrolled. It was contained, deliberate, purposeful. Her thoughts whispered inward, "You don't get to erase me. Not tonight, not ever again." For the first time since the sandwich had been placed in front of her, Naomi felt calm. The shadows of the past no longer haunted her. They guided her. Each memory, each wound, each dismissal was no longer a burden. They were bricks in the foundation of what she was about to build. Naomi woke from a shallow doze. Her mind jolted awake not by turbulence, but by the sound of Melissa's voice. The attendant's tone was hushed, meant for the passenger across the aisle, but Naomi caught every syllable. "Some people don't quite fit the profile for first class," Melissa said with a practiced smile. "But you belong here." The man chuckled, his voice thick with wine. Naomi didn't turn her head, but her heart thrummed with recognition. It wasn't what Melissa said, it was what she left unsaid. Naomi had been erased again, rendered invisible even as she sat no more than 2 feet away. She pressed her fingers to her temples, steadying herself. This wasn't just about her anymore. She thought of the interns at Aurelia who looked up to her, the young women of color who sent her emails saying she gave them hope. What would she tell them if she swallowed this silently? That dignity came with conditions that, even with success, you were still invisible. No, that couldn't be the story. Her smartwatch vibrated gently, pulling her back. Elijah Carter's encrypted message slid across the small screen audit protocol standing by. Confirm when ready. Naomi exhaled. Elijah didn't need context. He had been with her long enough to sense when something was wrong. His precision was a mirror of her own. She typed back with deliberate calm, collect all crew behavior logs, emphasize selective service patterns, compile with timestamp markers. Seconds later, the reply arrived. Understood. Red line directive available on your command. Naomi folded her arms across her chest, staring at the untouched sandwich still perched on her tray. A symbol of dismissal. Yes, but now also a symbol of choice. She could eat it, accept the insult, pretend it hadn't happened, or she could leave it untouched. A quiet monument to everything wrong in that cabin. She chose the latter. The quiet hum of the aircraft masked her own heartbeat, which grew steadier with each passing minute. She felt herself settling into the rhythm of control, not the frantic kind, but the slow, deliberate kind that came before seismic change. She noticed Daniel, another attendant, approaching with a tray of desserts for the men across the aisle. He leaned lower than necessary, offering them chocolate mousse with an almost deferential tone. Not once did his eyes flick toward Naomi. She might as well have been a shadow stitched into her leather seat. When Daniel passed, Naomi leaned forward slightly, catching his attention with a soft but precise voice. "Excuse me, Mr. Clean." He froze, startled. "Yes." Ma'am, Naomi's gaze held him steady. "I have a question. According to Luminaire's policy, how are pre-ordered meals prioritized when there's a shortage?" Daniel hesitated, his hand tightening around the tray. "Typically, it's based on loyalty status and booking date." Naomi nodded slowly. "I see. Then, how do you explain my situation? I'm a Platinum Horizon member. I ordered my meal 8 days ago. I have the confirmation email. Yet I was served last, and with something I didn't order at all." The color drained slightly from Daniel's face. His lips parted as if to form an explanation, but nothing came. Naomi tilted her head, her eyes sharp yet calm. "If it's not discrimination, what is it?" Daniel stammered. It could be a system error, maybe a communication issue." Naomi leaned back, her smile cool, deliberate. "No need to explain further. I understand now." The words landed heavier than any accusation. Daniel lowered his head and hurried away, his steps brisk, as if escaping an invisible spotlight. Naomi didn't follow him with her gaze. She didn't need to. The silence left behind was proof enough. Her smartwatch pulsed again. Elijah's new update scrolled across preliminary data retrieved. Crew logs indicate repeated inconsistencies, high correlation between passenger demographics and service prioritization, evidence solid. Naomi scrolled further. Elijah had even attached 2 prior complaints against Melissa Grant buried, ignored, labeled insufficient evidence. Naomi's chest tightened, not from shock but from recognition. She had seen this before, patterns dismissed because they weren't loud enough, sharp enough, undeniable enough. Tonight, they would become undeniable. The cabin light shifted from blue to soft amber, signaling the final meal service before landing. Melissa appeared once more, pushing her polished cart, smiling too brightly at the men while skimming past Naomi. She set down porcelain plates in front of each white passenger lamb chops, salmon, risotto, all steaming and fragrant. Naomi's tray remained untouched, the cold sandwich still resting there like a scar that wouldn't fade. Melissa finally leaned toward Naomi, her tone syrupy. "Would you like another sandwich, Ms. Sinclair?" Naomi's lips curved into the faintest smile, a smile that carried no warmth. "No. I think I've been served enough tonight." For a fraction of a second, Melissa's face faltered. Then she recovered, her smile snapping back like a mask. She moved on without a word, but Naomi caught the flicker in her eyes' fear. Naomi closed her journal, tucked it into her bag, and sat upright. Her decision had crystallized. Tonight wouldn't end in silence. Tonight, the system itself would be forced to speak. She tapped her smartwatch again, her fingers steady as she typed 6 words that would change everything. Activate red line directive. Flight 829. Elijah's reply came instantly, confirmed. Evidence chain locked. Notification to Luminaire Executive Command initiated. Naomi's chest rose and fell with slow precision. The storm she had carried all evening was no longer swirling uncontrolled. It was now a sharpened current, directed, unrelenting. She looked out the window once more, at the dark sweep of clouds below. Somewhere beyond them lay Zurich. Boardrooms, contracts, headlines, but here, within this sealed cabin, another contract was being written, one not on paper, but in action. And as the plane cut through the night, Naomi knew the message was clear. Power didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it arrived in silence, in timing, in one decisive command. The announcement came through the cabin speakers. "Calm and neutral, ladies and gentlemen. We are beginning our initial descent into Zurich. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing." The cabin stirred awake. Seat backs rose, trays were collected, blankets folded. Passengers shifted in their seats, checking watches, stretching their arms. Naomi remained perfectly still, her posture as straight as the seat itself. On her tray, the untouched sandwich had become a statement, its presence louder than any argument she could have made aloud. Melissa walked down the aisle, checking belts and trays, her professional smile in place. She glanced at Naomi but quickly looked away, her pace just slightly quicker as she passed seat 2A. Naomi caught the flicker of unease. It was small, but it was there, the first crack in the mask. Naomi's smartwatch pulsed again, almost in rhythm with the hum of the engines. Elijah's message appeared in discreet green text, red line directive acknowledged. Executive response team will meet at Zurich Gate. Evidence chain secure. Prepare for debrief. Naomi exhaled slowly, allowing herself a single moment of quiet relief. The wheels of accountability were already in motion, and not even Melissa's practiced indifference could stop them. She leaned back and closed her eyes. Though she wasn't resting, her thoughts gathered with precision. This wasn't about humiliation, it was about correction. Not vengeance, but reform. And she would see it through. Not for herself alone, but for every unseen passenger who had endured moments like this in silence. The plane trembled slightly as it dipped lower, Zurich's lights still distant glimmers below the clouds. Naomi opened her eyes, her reflection faint against the window. For an instant, she saw not just herself, but her mother's steady gaze, her father's quiet hands fixing radios late into the night. She heard Angela's voice again. "Don't let the world break you." And she whispered under her breath, so soft no one else could hear, "I won't." The landing gear extended with a heavy thud. The cabin lights brightened to a clean white glow, exposing every face, every nervous glance, every mask of composure. Melissa stood at the front of the aisle now, giving her rehearsed announcement about arrival procedures, but Naomi saw the stiffness in her shoulders, the slight shake in her voice when she reached the end. As the plane touched the runway with a jolt, Naomi felt no turbulence inside herself. She was steady, calm, sharper than ever. The descent wasn't just about the aircraft, it was about Melissa, about Luminaire, about a culture that thought dignity could be rationed. Tonight, that culture had begun its own descent. The aircraft slowed, brakes humming, until it finally taxied to a stop at the Zurich terminal. Seatbelts unbuckled, overhead bins popped open, bags were pulled down in a flurry of impatience. Passengers chatted eagerly about connecting trains, hotels, dinner reservations. Naomi stood only when she was ready. She reached for her leather bag, sliding it over her shoulder with practiced ease. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, a contrast to the bustling impatience around her. At the front of the cabin, two figures in dark suits stepped inside, a tall man with steel-gray hair and a shorter woman carrying a slim tablet. Their badges identified them as Luminaire's European Operations Director and a representative from the Legal Affairs Division. Both scanned the cabin quickly, their eyes stopping on Naomi. They bowed their heads slightly. "Ms. Sinclair," the man said, his voice low but clear. "We'll escort you directly to the executive lounge. Mr. Reeves has been notified." Naomi offered a polite nod, then stepped into the aisle. Her heels clicked against the floor, each step precise, controlled. As she passed Melissa, she caught the faint scent of the attendant's perfume again. Melissa tried to meet her eyes, but Naomi's gaze slid past, cool and unyielding. The same dismissal she had endured turned back like a mirror. Behind her, she heard the faint shift in tone as the operations director spoke to Melissa and the crew. "All Flight 829 staff, please proceed to the emergency debriefing room. This is mandatory." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Naomi didn't turn back, but she knew what was unfolding. The masks were cracking. The quiet storm had arrived. Stepping out of the jet bridge into the Zurich terminal, Naomi was met by another pair of executives in dark suits. They flanked her discreetly, guiding her toward a side corridor that bypassed the main crowd of passengers. The terminal was bright, sterile, its glass walls reflecting the soft gleam of city lights beyond. Inside the private executive lounge, silence reigned. A long wooden table stood in the center, polished to a mirror shine. Bottled water and neatly stacked files lined its surface. Naomi was invited to sit at the head of the table. She placed her bag beside her chair, sat down gracefully, and folded her hands. The operations director sat across from her. His voice was careful, deliberate. "Ms. Sinclair, first allow me to extend our apology. What you experienced tonight is unacceptable. Mr. Reeves has authorized a full investigation into Flight 829's crew. We would also like to request your direct input during this process." Naomi's gaze was unwavering. An apology is a beginning, but what matters is whether the system changes. The director nodded quickly. "Understood. Our HR and legal teams are already reviewing the evidence your assistant provided. We'll suspend the crew immediately until the investigation is complete." Naomi leaned slightly forward, her voice calm but sharp. "I don't want suspension. I want systemic correction. Melissa Grant is not an isolated case, she is a symptom. If you treat her as the only problem, the system will fail again. The woman from legal affairs tapped her tablet nervously. We have reviewed her file. There are patterns, complaints dismissed, inconsistencies overlooked. It appears this isn't the first time. Naomi nodded once, her point proven without needing another word. She reached into her bag and pulled out her leather journal, laying it flat on the table. This is not about me receiving a meal. It is about every invisible moment that was tolerated, every shrug that went unchallenged. Tonight, I chose not to be silent. But tomorrow, someone else might not have the resources I do. Will you protect them too? The operations director's jaw tightened. He exhaled slowly. We will. This won't be buried. Naomi leaned back, her eyes drifting to the glass wall of the lounge. Beyond it, planes taxied under the midnight glow of Zurich's lights. She felt the weight of the night pressing on her shoulders, but also something lighter, a sense of inevitability. The truth was finally out in the open, and there was no undoing it. Her smartwatch vibrated once more. Elijah's message appeared: full evidence package delivered to Reeves. Global review scheduled for morning. Proud of you, Naomi? She smiled faintly, just enough to soften the steel in her expression. For the first time all night, she allowed herself a sip of water, the cool liquid washing away the dryness in her throat. The descent had ended. But for Luminaire, for Melissa, for the industry itself, this was only the beginning of their fall and their chance to rise differently. Jonathan Reeves arrived with the air of a man who understood both urgency and optics. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a streak of silver at his temples. He walked into the Zurich Executive Lounge flanked by two senior advisors. His presence shifted the atmosphere immediately. Naomi noticed how the operations director straightened in his seat, how the legal affairs woman adjusted her tablet nervously. Jonathan wasn't just the CEO of Luminaire. He was its face, its weight, its authority. Naomi rose slowly from her chair. Their eyes met across the polished table, and for a moment, silence held. Jonathan extended his hand. "Naomi," he said, his tone carefully respectful. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." She shook his hand firmly, her gaze unwavering. Circumstances have a way of revealing truth. Tonight is no exception. Jonathan gestured for everyone to sit, and they did. He leaned forward, folding his hands together. "I've reviewed the preliminary data Elijah Carter submitted. I want to hear it from you directly." What happened on Flight 829, Naomi's voice was calm, each word deliberate. "I pre-ordered my meal 8 days ago. I confirmed my Platinum Horizon status. Yet when service began, I was given a turkey sandwich while other passengers received the entrees they requested. When I questioned it, I was dismissed. And then I heard your lead attendant make a remark that made the intent clear. I was not considered a passenger who mattered." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He glanced briefly at his advisors before returning his eyes to Naomi. "I won't insult you by asking if you're certain. The evidence is clear." Naomi nodded once. "Evidence matters, but acknowledgement matters more. This isn't just about a sandwich, it's about a pattern, a culture that decides who deserves respect and who doesn't." The room stilled. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping once against the table. "I can't defend what happened. I won't. What I can promise is action." Naomi leaned slightly forward, her eyes sharp. "Action must go beyond suspension. You can replace a crew, but unless you address the system that protects them, this will repeat. Luminaire cannot afford to present itself as a luxury brand while tolerating discriminatory service. Not with your customers. Not with your partners. One of Jonathan's advisors cleared his throat. Ms. Sinclair, we agree this is serious. But grounding an entire crew and launching a systemic audit will cause headlines. Investors may interpret this as instability. Jonathan cut him off with a raised hand. His eyes never left Naomi. Headlines will come either way. The question is whether we lead them or chase them. For the first time that night, Naomi allowed herself a small smile. Then lead them. The legal affairs representative shifted uneasily. Mr. Reeves, the evidence package includes prior complaints against Melissa Grant. If those had been handled properly, tonight might never have happened. Jonathan's expression darkened. Then the failure isn't just hers, it's ours. Naomi opened her journal, flipping to a blank page. She spoke as she wrote, her words crisp. You have an opportunity here, Jonathan. Not just to apologize, but to redefine what luxury means. True luxury isn't about chandeliers or champagne. It's about dignity. It's about every passenger, regardless of their profile, being seen and respected. Jonathan watched her, his eyes thoughtful. After a long pause, he nodded. You're right. We'll do more than apologize. He turned to his advisors. Effective immediately. Suspend the entire crew of Flight 829 pending investigation. Initiate a full review of service protocols across all international routes. And draft a public statement. We own this mistake before it owns us. The advisors scribbled notes, their faces pale but resolute. Naomi sat back, her pen resting against the journal. That's a beginning. But I also want transparency. Too many incidents like mine have been buried. I want the review's findings published, not hidden in internal memos. Jonathan considered, then inclined his head. Agreed. If we are to regain trust, hiding will only erode it further. The operations director looked uneasy. Sir, the unions will resist. Crew suspensions at this scale will spark backlash. Jonathan's voice was firm. Then let them resist. We're not negotiating dignity. Silence followed, heavy but charged with something new. Naomi felt the air shift, the balance of power tilting. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't needed to. Her calm precision had done what anger alone never could. It had forced acknowledgement, forced change. She reached for her glass of water, sipping slowly. Jonathan, I've been in enough boardrooms to know promises are easy. Execution is what matters. If you want to prove Luminaire stands for dignity, invite voices like mine into the process. Don't just fix the symptom, rebuild the structure. Jonathan leaned back, studying her. Are you offering? Naomi's lips curved faintly. I'm suggesting. The choice is yours. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with the weight of decision settling in his voice, he replied, Then I'll take that suggestion. Luminaire needs accountability from the outside in, and I can't think of anyone better equipped to help us build it. Naomi closed her journal gently. Then, let's see if you mean it. The meeting adjourned with swift efficiency. Advisors hurried to draft statements. The operations director placed calls to Zurich's staff, and the legal affairs representative began assembling files for HR. Jonathan remained behind for a moment, watching Naomi gather her bag. He said quietly, almost as if to himself, I built this airline on the idea that the sky should feel limitless. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that the sky has to belong to everyone. Naomi paused, meeting his gaze, then remind them, not with words, but with change. As she walked out of the lounge, the terminal's glass walls reflected her silhouette. Outside, dawn was breaking faintly over Zurich, streaks of pale pink cutting through the horizon. Naomi felt the weight of the night finally ease. It wasn't over, not by far, but the reckoning had begun. By the time Naomi left the Zurich Executive Lounge, the news was already in motion. Jonathan Reeves had kept his word. Luminaire's communications team moved quickly, drafting and releasing a statement before sunrise. The language was careful but direct. Luminaire Airlines acknowledges the service failure on Flight 809 involving Platinum Horizon member and CEO Naomi Sinclair. We have suspended the entire crew pending investigation and initiated a full review of service equity protocols across all international routes. Within an hour, headlines began to ripple across digital feeds. Black CEO denied meal in first-class Luminaire responds with sweeping action. Social media picked up the story with force. Passengers who had once felt sidelined began posting their own experiences, attaching the hashtag #SeenIn the Sky. What started as a scandal quickly evolved into a movement. Naomi watched from the tinted windows of her car as she was driven into Zurich's city center. Screens outside shops glowed with breaking news alerts, her own name scrolling across them. She sat silently, processing. She hadn't wanted to become the face of yet another story about discrimination, but perhaps she hadn't had a choice. Stories like hers had been erased too often. This time, there would be no erasure. Her phone buzzed with calls. She ignored journalists, board members, even a senator she barely knew. She scrolled past them and opened a private channel to Elijah. His message appeared almost instantly. "You're everywhere, Naomi, and they're listening this time." She typed back, "Good, but listening isn't enough. Let's see how long they remember." At Aurelia Dynamics' Zurich office, her team was already waiting. They stood as she entered, their faces a mixture of concern and admiration. One young analyst, Sophia, whispered, "We saw the feed. Ms. Sinclair, thank you for showing them we're not invisible." Naomi placed her bag on the table and looked around at the team. "Don't thank me yet. Change isn't proven by one headline. It's proven by whether the next person is treated differently." As she settled into the morning's agenda, the fallout continued to build. News anchors debated whether Reeves had overreacted by suspending an entire crew. Passenger rights groups praised Naomi's stand, while some industry insiders muttered about optics and PR damage. Naomi listened but didn't engage. She had no interest in defending herself in sound bites. She was more interested in what Luminaire would do next. Meanwhile, inside Luminaire headquarters, Jonathan Reeves faced his own reckoning. The board demanded answers. Why had the company moved so fast with this spark union protests? Could investors be reassured Jonathan stood at the head of the conference table, hands steady? "This isn't about investors or unions," he said firmly. "It's about whether Luminaire stands for dignity or for profit at any cost. If we choose profit at the expense of dignity, we lose both." Naomi wasn't present, but she felt the ripples of his decision. Reports reached her that Reeves had ordered a comprehensive review of past passenger complaints, focusing on patterns dismissed as minor. He had also invited an independent diversity council to audit the airline's culture. And, most tellingly, he had asked if Naomi would consider advising the council. Her initial instinct was caution. She didn't want to be a token consultant wheeled out for credibility. She wanted real change, That night, as she reviewed Elijah's compiled evidence, she found herself asking, can they actually change? Or will this be another apology drowned in noise? She thought back to her father again. Thomas had taught her how to fix what was broken, but he had also warned her some things aren't worth fixing. You have to know the difference. Was Luminaire worth fixing? Her smartwatch buzzed again with a new alert. This one wasn't from Elijah, but from a trending social feed. A young woman had posted a video describing her own experience of being ignored in first class because she was wearing a hijab. Another man described being assumed to be in the wrong seat on 3 separate flights. Naomi scrolled through dozens more. Their voices weren't polished or strategic, but raw, unfiltered, human. She closed her eyes briefly. The movement was already larger than her. It wasn't just her sandwich, it was every shrug, every dismissal, every moment of being unseen. And that realization steadied her. The next morning, she walked into another meeting with Jonathan Reeves. Cameras waited outside, flashes bouncing against the glass walls, inside. However, the atmosphere was different, less defensive, more charged with the urgency of reform. Jonathan looked tired, his tie slightly askew, but his voice was strong. Naomi, the fallout is bigger than expected, but so is the support. I want you to help guide this not as a consultant for optics, but as a partner for real reform. Naomi studied him for a long moment. If I say yes, Jonathan, I won't soften the truth. I won't be quiet for the sake of shareholders. He nodded once. That's exactly why I need you. For the first time in 2 days. Naomi allowed herself a small breath of relief. The reckoning wasn't over, but it had shifted. What had begun as humiliation in the sky was becoming transformation on the ground. Later that evening, she returned to her hotel and stood at the window. Zurich spread out below in golden lights. She thought of Angela, her mother, who had once whispered not to let the world break her. Naomi whispered back into the night, I won't. Mama, I won't. Her phone buzzed one more time this time, a message from Sophia, the young analyst. It read, because of you. I believe I belong in every room I walk into. Thank you. Naomi closed her eyes, letting the words sink deep. This was why she had chosen not to be silent. This was why she had endured the storm. Not for herself alone, but for every voice that deserved to be heard. The fallout was only beginning, but for the first time, it carried not just pain, but possibility. The ripple Naomi had felt in Zurich grew into waves within days. Major newspapers dedicated front-page spreads to the story, not just because of the spectacle of a CEO being denied a meal in first class, but because of what it represented. The world was watching an industry forced into self-examination, something airlines rarely allowed themselves. Naomi sat in the back of a black sedan on her way to a Zurich conference hall, where Jonathan Reeves had invited her to speak at an emergency roundtable. Screens outside cafes and transit hubs carried scrolling banners, airline industry faces reckoning after Luminaire scandal. Her name was mentioned not just as the victim, but as a catalyst. She glanced at her phone. Elijah's latest report blinked on her screen. 4 competing airlines have announced reviews of their service policies. One is suspending crew accused of bias. The "Chest Seen in the Sky" hashtag has passed 12 million mentions in 48 hours. Naomi exhaled softly, her reflection flickering in the car window. She hadn't asked for this spotlight. Yet here it was, burning brighter each hour. She thought of her father again, his hands guiding wires into place. When something doesn't work, you don't wait. You fix it. Inside the conference hall, executives and media representatives buzzed like a restless hive. Jonathan Reeves stood at the podium, tie tightened this time, shoulders squared. When Naomi entered, heads turned. Conversations paused. She walked with her usual deliberate calm, heels clicking against the marble floor, her leather journal tucked under her arm. Jonathan greeted her with a nod, then turned to the press. Today isn't about a single flight or a single crew. It's about an industry that has too often failed to see every passenger. Naomi Sinclair's experience forced us to confront that failure, and we will not walk away unchanged. He gestured for her to step forward. Naomi paused for a moment, then moved to the podium. She rested her journal gently beside her, looked out at the sea of cameras and faces, and began. I did not choose to become a headline. I chose to take a flight, a simple act one many of you have done countless times. But on Flight 829, I was reminded that, for some of us, even the simplest acts are shadowed by dismissal. Not because of a booking error, not because of an oversight, but because of who we are. Her voice was calm, but the silence in the room was absolute. This is not about one meal. It is about the thousands of quiet dismissals passengers face every day, the shrug, the glance, the tone that says you do not belong. Some are too subtle for headlines, but each one is a cut, and cuts, left to fester, become wounds our society cannot heal. She let the words settle before continuing. I am not here for revenge. I am here for reform. I don't want another headline next week about a different Naomi on a different flight with the same wound. I want systems that protect dignity, not undermine it. If luxury means anything, it must mean respect. The cameras flashed, but Naomi kept her eyes steady on the crowd. She thought of Sophia, her young analyst, and the message she had sent. She thought of her mother's voice. Don't let them think your silence is consent. She thought of Melissa Grant, somewhere now suspended, perhaps realizing too late that small acts can topple giants. When Naomi stepped away from the podium, Jonathan returned. His voice carried a firmness that surprised even his own board members. Luminaire will launch the industry's first independent passenger dignity council, and I am asking Naomi Sinclair to chair it. Gasps rippled through the hall. Naomi felt them, but did not react outwardly. She glanced briefly at Jonathan, who held her gaze, then inclined her head once. If we do this, Jonathan, it cannot be symbolic, it must be binding. He nodded. Binding. That single word sent tremors through the room. For decades, airlines had avoided binding commitments to equality or service equity. Now, one of the largest carriers had just promised it on record. After the round table, as the hall emptied, Jonathan approached Naomi quietly. You handled them better than I could have. Naomi smiled faintly. That's because I've been handling them my entire life. Later, alone in her hotel suite, Naomi finally let herself breathe. She stood at the window again, Zurich glowing beneath her, the lake shimmering faintly in the distance. She pulled out her journal and wrote, The sky belongs to all of us. Tonight, for the first time, they almost believed it. Her smartwatch buzzed again. Elijah, of course. Media calling you a reformer, a disruptor. Some call you difficult. You okay with that? She typed back quickly. Difficult women change the world. Elijah. Let them call me that. She set the watch aside, closing her eyes. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel tired, to feel human, to feel the ache in her chest ease. The world had cracked open, but she knew cracks were fragile. Tomorrow would bring pushback, unions resisting, investors questioning. But tonight, she held on to the truth the tremors had begun, and there was no going back. The following morning, Naomi awoke to a cascade of notifications. Her phone, placed on the bedside table, pulsed with headlines, messages, and opinion pieces. She hadn't touched it yet. Instead, she sat at the small desk in her hotel suite, a cup of black coffee cooling beside her, and stared at the leather-bound journal she had carried for years. Pages filled with sketches, quotes, fragments of speeches, and whispered thoughts stared back at her. The headlines outside her window were loud. Naomi Sinclair forces airlines to face hidden bias. Luminaire CEO bows to passenger outcry, from boardroom to runway. How one woman sparked an industry reckoning, but beneath the noise there were shadows. Naomi knew this from experience. For every hand raised in applause, another was clenched in resentment. She finally unlocked her phone and scrolled. Alongside praise were bitter words. Overreacting CEO pulls the race card again. It was just a sandwich. Maybe she should take a private jet if she wants special treatment. Naomi set the phone down, breathing slowly. She had expected this. The backlash was as predictable as the applause. She thought of her mother's voice. Some people will always prefer your silence, but silence doesn't heal anything. Her thoughts drifted to Melissa Grant. Where was she now in a holding room, perhaps being questioned by HR and legal? Naomi pictured her face, that faint smirk as she laid down the cold tray. Did Melissa feel regret or only humiliation at being caught? Naomi wrestled with the question not out of pity, but because she had always believed change meant more than punishment. Yet, if the system did not enforce consequences, the cycle would never break. The morning passed with a series of calls. Elijah, his voice brisk but tinged with fatigue, briefed her on the latest developments. Naomi, the council proposal is everywhere. Investors are cautious but intrigued. Reeves is being hailed as progressive, but we both know he's hedging. Also, one of the unions isn't happy. They're calling the suspensions unfair. Naomi leaned back in her chair. Unfair? She asked softly. Yes. Their statement claims crew members were sacrificed for optics. They're saying bias is too subjective to be grounds for dismissal. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, pressing her fingers against her temples. Subjective. When it's repeated, documented, and corroborated by data that's not subjective, that's systemic. She could hear Elijah tapping at his keyboard. I'll draft a response if you want. No, Naomi replied. Let the system speak for itself. If we start playing defense, we've already lost. By noon. Naomi walked through Zurich's narrow streets, her long coat pulled tightly around her against the cool air. She stopped at a quiet cafe, one she had visited years ago during her first pitch to a Swiss investor who later doubted her every move. Back then, she'd been offered tea while her male colleagues were offered wine, a small slight, ignored by many, but etched into her memory. Now, the waiter greeted her with a smile, placing a menu before her with the words, "It is an honor to serve you. Ms. Sinclair." She ordered only a cappuccino, but the gesture was not lost on her. Respect, even in small forms, mattered. She sipped slowly, letting herself feel the weight of the moment. Change was happening, but so was resistance. Later that day, Naomi was invited to join a panel discussion at a Zurich media forum. The moderator, a sharp-eyed journalist with a clipped accent, did not waste time with pleasantries. "Ms. Sinclair, you've been praised for sparking reform, but critics argue you weaponized your influence. They say ordinary passengers don't have your platform. How do you respond?" Naomi tilted her head slightly, her voice steady but edged with steel. "Ordinary passengers shouldn't need my platform. The point is that systems must protect dignity for everyone, not just those with power. If my visibility forced accountability, then the responsibility of the industry is to ensure the next passenger doesn't have to fight this battle alone." The journalist pressed further. Some claim this was an overreaction, that this was, after all, just a meal. Naomi met his gaze without flinching. Dignity is never just a meal. Dignity is in the glance, the tone, the silence that says you don't matter. When you strip away excuses, what remains is the truth that, for some of us, exclusion is normalized, and I will not normalize it. The audience, filled with both supporters and skeptics, erupted in applause. Naomi did not smile. She simply folded her hands in her lap, her mind already on the work ahead. That night, as she returned to her suite, exhaustion pressed against her like a heavy cloak. She sat at the window again, overlooking the still waters of Lake Zurich. She opened her journal and began to write, the pen scratching softly. I used to believe change came from innovation alone. Build better systems, smarter tools, stronger platforms. But change begins with courage, someone refusing to accept dismissal, even in its smallest form. Today, I am tired. Tomorrow, I will be ready again. Her hand hesitated, then she added another line. If backlash is the cost of truth, then let them come. She closed the journal, placed it on the nightstand, and allowed herself a rare smile, not because the battle was won, but because it had finally begun. The following week, Naomi Sinclair found herself back in New York. The city buzzed louder than usual, not only with its endless horns and restless footsteps, but also with the storm her actions had unleashed. Billboards on Times Square rotated between ads and a headline that froze her in place for a moment. Seat 1A. A movement begins. She had never intended for a hashtag to define her choices, yet by her seat, 1A had become more than a viral campaign. It had grown into a collective banner for those who had once swallowed indignities in silence. Thousands of stories now filled social feeds, letters from teachers, artists, single parents, entrepreneurs, each describing moments when they had been denied respect not because of merit, but because of perception. At Aurelia Dynamics headquarters, the boardroom was unusually tense. Screens along the walls displayed data analytics pulled from Sentinel Nexus maps of airports, where discrimination complaints had spiked. Graphs showing increased customer churn when bias was left unaddressed, and sentiment charts reflecting both praise and backlash against Naomi's stand. Her board members were split. One, a graying investor named Harris, leaned forward, his tone firm. "Naomi, we built this company on tech, not social movements. Some of our stakeholders are nervous. They're asking if Aurelia's drifting too far into politics." Naomi listened, her fingers tapping lightly on the polished table. Then she spoke, calm but cutting through the tension. "This isn't politics, Harris. It's humanity. If our technology can expose bias, If our voice can demand dignity, then staying silent would betray the very purpose we claim to serve. Another board member, younger and more progressive, nodded. She's right. Our clients aren't just buying systems, they're buying trust. And right now, the world trusts Naomi more than any brand. The conversation continued, balancing caution and conviction, but Naomi's mind was already ahead. The movement could not stop at airlines. It needed to expand to hotels, to corporate hiring, to healthcare, to any place where invisibility thrived behind polished smiles. That evening, Naomi met Elijah Carter at a quiet restaurant tucked between two brownstones in Brooklyn. He had flown in from Zurich only hours before, but his energy was steady, his loyalty unwavering. "They're calling you a disruptor," he said with a faint grin as they sat across from each other, steam rising from their plates. "And not just in tech. People are whispering your name in boardrooms that once ignored you." Naomi lifted her glass of water, studying the ripples before replying. "Whispers are fine. What matters is whether they're ready to act when the spotlight fades." Elijah leaned closer, lowering his voice. Reeves called again. "He wants you to officially chair Luminaire's Reform Council. He's offering unprecedented authority training protocols, hiring oversight, even cultural audits. It's a seat no outsider has ever held." Naomi stirred her food slowly, weighing the decision. She thought of Melissa Grant again, of the countless quiet dismissals replicated by others like her across industries. Accept in the council would mean walking into hostile territory, where defenders of the old ways would resist every step, but rejecting it might signal retreat. "Tell Reeves I'll consider it," she said finally. Elijah studied her, then asked softly, "Do you ever regret it, pressing that call button?" Sending the directive, Naomi's gaze drifted to the window, where the city lights blinked like restless stars. "Regret," she echoed. "No. The only thing I regret is not doing it sooner for all the times I stayed silent, thinking endurance was strength. It took one cold tray to remind me that silence only feeds the system." The days that followed were relentless. Naomi spoke at universities, where young students of color crowded around her after lectures, their eyes wide with both admiration and unspoken questions. "Can I really belong? Will my work ever be enough?" She listened more than she spoke, knowing her presence was already an answer. She was invited to testify before a Senate subcommittee on corporate accountability. Senators fired questions, some supportive, others skeptical. One leaned forward, asking pointedly, "Ms. Sinclair, do you believe unconscious bias can truly be measured? Or is this just a narrative to push diversity quotas?" Naomi's reply was steady, her tone almost gentle but unyielding. "Bias is not a narrative. It's measurable in response times, in service records, in pay gaps, in promotion delays. If we can measure data to predict markets, we can measure data to reveal inequity. The question is not if we can, it's whether we want to face what we find." Her words echoed through the chamber, later replayed on evening news across the nation. But backlash, too, grew sharper. Conservative commentators accused her of turning personal grievance into global agenda. Anonymous messages flooded her inbox, some cruel, some threatening. Naomi read them without flinching, though in quieter moments she admitted to herself that the weight was heavy. One night, unable to sleep, she revisited the journal on her nightstand. She reread her earlier entries, the ink smudged slightly by the pressure of her hand. Then she began a new page. "Strength is not in never being shaken. Strength is in rising again, even when the ground beneath feels unstable. If I falter, let it be human, but let me never falter in dignity. Weeks later, Luminaire hosted its first public forum on cultural reform, streamed live worldwide. Naomi sat on stage beside Jonathan Reeves, who, for all his corporate polish, seemed humbled in her presence. Crew members, executives, and passengers filled the hall. Cameras captured every moment. When it was her turn to speak, Naomi stood slowly, letting silence settle before she began. "I did not ask for this role," she said, her voice carrying without strain. "I did not wake up one morning hoping to challenge an industry. I pressed a call button because I was denied a meal I had ordered. But beneath that tray was something larger, a message that I was less, that I did not belong. That is what we are here to confront." She paused, scanning the faces before her. Some were sympathetic, others wary. This is not about me. This is about every traveler, every employee, every human being who has been made to feel invisible. Reform is not charity, it is justice, and justice is not optional. The hall was silent for a beat, then applause surged, rolling like a tide. Naomi did not smile, but her eyes softened. She knew applause was fleeting, but she also knew seeds had been planted. Later, as she left the stage, a young flight attendant in uniform approached her hesitantly. "Ms. Sinclair," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw what happened to you. I've seen it happen to others, and I never spoke up. But because of you, I will now. I promise." Naomi touched her shoulder gently. "That's all I ask. Speak. Don't let silence be the system's ally." That night, Naomi sat alone in her office, overlooking the Hudson River. The lights reflected across the water, rippling with movement. She thought again of her mother's words. "Silence doesn't heal anything." She whispered them aloud, letting the truth settle. The battle was far from over, but the tide had turned. And in her heart, Naomi knew that the real victory was not in firing a crew or in shaking an airline. It was in awakening voices that had long been quiet. Winter settled over New York like a heavy quilt, the kind that muffled the city's usual roar into a muted hum. From the tall windows of Aurelia Dynamics headquarters, Naomi Sinclair looked out across the Hudson River. Snowflakes swirled in the air, catching the light of the skyscrapers like tiny sparks. It had been months since Flight 829, months since a cold sandwich in first class had set off a chain reaction that neither she nor anyone else could have fully predicted. Now, the world looked different. Not perfect, not healed, but undeniably changed. On her desk lay a thick report bound in navy blue, the Council on Passenger Dignity. First Annual Review. The pages inside documented not only Luminaire's progress but also industry-wide reforms, policies rewritten, training programs revamped, complaints once buried now tracked transparently in public dashboards. Some airlines resisted, of course, but others followed, pushed by public demand and emboldened by Naomi's unyielding voice. She traced the embossed title with her finger, remembering the girl she had once been, the girl who thought silence was survival, who carried her mother's words like a fragile shield. Silence doesn't heal anything. That girl had grown into the woman standing here now, scarred but unbroken, steady in the storm. Her phone buzzed. Elijah Carter's voice filled the room when she answered. "Naomi, the council meeting starts in 15 minutes. Reeves will join virtually from London. They're expecting your closing remarks." Naomi smiled faintly. always ready to close what we've opened. Elijah. The meeting room was already full when she arrived. Representatives from airlines, passenger rights groups, and even unions sat around the oval table. Cameras streamed the session worldwide. At the far end, Jonathan Reeves appeared on the large screen, looking older, perhaps wearier, but still resolute. The moderator began, summarizing the year's progress. Complaints have decreased by 34% across participating airlines. Bias training has reached over 70,000 crew members. Transparency dashboards have been accessed over 2 million times by passengers. While challenges remain, the Council has established a framework for accountability unseen in this industry before. Applause rippled through the room. Naomi listened quietly, her leather journal resting on the table before her. When the moderator invited her to speak, she rose slowly, letting her presence fill the silence before she began. I've been asked many times if I ever imagined that a single flight could lead to all this. The truth is, no, I did not set out to change an industry. I set out to be treated with the dignity every human being deserves. What happened on Flight 829 was not extraordinary, it was ordinary. And that is why it mattered, because ordinary dismissals, repeated across millions of lives, carve extraordinary wounds. She paused, scanning the faces around her. We have made progress. But progress is fragile. It survives only if we guard it, nurture it, and demand it again and again. This council is not the end, it is the beginning. Our legacy will not be measured by reports or headlines, but by whether the next generation boards a flight and never wonders if they belong. The room erupted in applause, but Naomi did not bask in it. Instead, she closed her journal, knowing her words would echo far beyond the walls. After the meeting, Jonathan Reeves stayed behind on the screen. Naomi, he said, his voice softer than usual, you've done what I could not. You turned an airline's shame into an industry's conscience. For that, I owe you more than thanks. Naomi tilted her head slightly. You don't owe me, Jonathan. You owe the passengers. You owe the people who trusted you with their journeys. Just keep earning that trust. That evening, Naomi walked through Central Park, snow crunching beneath her boots. The city glowed with holiday lights. Families skating on the ice rink. Children laughing as they toppled in heaps of scarves and mittens. She paused on a bridge, leaning against the railing, watching their joy. Her thoughts drifted to her parents. She imagined Angela's warm smile, Thomas's steady hands. She whispered into the cold air, "We're seen now, at least a little more than before." Her phone buzzed again, a message from Sophia, the young analyst at Aurelia who once told her, "Because of you, I believe I belong in every room." The message read, "We're finalizing our new mentorship program for young women of color in tech. We're calling it the Sinclair Initiative. I hope you don't mind." Naomi's breath caught, her eyes warming with tears she rarely allowed herself. She typed back, "I don't mind. Make it strong. Make it last." As she slipped her phone back into her pocket, a calm settled over her. She had not erased injustice. She had not healed every wound, but she had struck a chord that would keep resonating, and sometimes resonance was more powerful than resolution. When she finally returned home that night, she sat by her window overlooking the Hudson again. She opened her journal to its final page and wrote slowly, deliberately. Flight 829 began with silence. It ended with voices louder than I could have imagined. If this is my legacy, let it be one of courage, not perfection. Let it remind the world that dignity is not a luxury. It is the sky itself, and it belongs to all of us. She set down her pen, closed the journal, and let the stillness of the night embrace her. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained echoes that carried hope, healing, and the promise of skies more open than ever before. Naomi's story reminds us that injustice rarely begins with loud moments. It often hides in the quiet dismissals we are asked to endure. A missing meal in first class may seem small, but for Naomi, it became a symbol of something deeper. The constant reminder that dignity is conditional for some, while guaranteed for others. The lesson is clear. Dignity is not a luxury, it is a right. For older audiences who have lived through decades of change, this story may echo personal memories of times when silence seemed safer than resistance. But Naomi's journey shows that silence does not heal. It only allows wounds to deepen. By choosing courage, even in a quiet and steady way, she turned a moment of humiliation into a movement for accountability and respect. The takeaway for all of us is simple but powerful. We cannot always control how others treat us, but we can choose how we respond. And when we choose dignity, when we refuse to accept invisibility, we create change not just for ourselves but for everyone who comes after us. Thank you so much for watching and for walking with us through this powerful story. If Naomi's journey moved you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and heal. Your support helps us keep bringing voices like this to light.